I am ready to do anything to erase from my memory the day when I witnessed how my wife cheated on me. And as it usually happens, nothing foreshadowed trouble. She appeared out of nowhere. Everything was in a rush. Seriously. My employers had just acquired a much smaller company that had recently gone under. I assume they probably got everything at a bargain from the administrators. Despite our company having been quite successful recently and already overwhelmed with work, management was in a bit of a panic to integrate the new acquisition and get everything running smoothly. To that end, a group of us were sent up there to reorient the staff and oversee the implementation of our company systems. In short, it was complete chaos for a couple of weeks. There had been little time for proper planning, and almost everything was being done on the fly. This included replacing the newly acquired company's computer network, which wasn't sufficient, and installing all the necessary wiring. In brief, the 10 of us were running around like headless chickens during the day and meeting up in the hotel bar most evenings to plan what was supposed to happen the next day. None of us lived more than an hour away by train, but we were all staying in town most nights due to these crucial evening meetings. A few of the team managed to slip home occasionally to see their families, but who could leave depended on what was happening that day and early the next morning. Anyway, feeling pretty exhausted, I had been sitting in the hotel bar for about half an hour, waiting for the rest of the crew, when she walked in. Sherry was one of the IT specialists hired from a consulting company to help set up the computer systems and train the staff. And wow, was I surprised when I realized who had just walked into the bar. Sherry looked nothing like the nerdy trainer I'd been working with all day. Gone were the baggy sweater, the calf-length skirt, and the glasses, replaced by a short skirt and a well-fitted silk blouse. She didn't look around, or scope out the place, as you might expect. Sherry just took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink. I figured she was waiting for someone, and I couldn't help but wonder which of my married colleagues was about to stray from the straight and narrow. All right, I'll admit it. I shot up from my table and quickly slid onto the stool next to Sherry. "Hey, beautiful. What's a classy girl like you doing in a place like this?" I asked, trying to sound as seductive as possible. Sherry turned to look at me, probably about to give me a dirty look and tell me off, but then she recognized me. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Steve, cut it out." "What are you doing here?" she said with a grin. "I'm staying here, Sherry," I replied, motioning to the bartender to put her drink on my tab. "And by the way, I asked you first. I'm meeting John, one of those electrician guys, for dinner. He lives nearby and is picking me up here." "I thought you tech guys were all staying at the Connaught." "We are, but John doesn't need to know that, does he?" She winked. "Besides, the fewer people who know I date, the better. I avoid dating colleagues from my own company. It just gets too complicated." "Ah, so that's why you keep a low profile in the office?" I'm not sure how I should take that. I'll assume it was a compliment. "It definitely was, Sherry, on how you look right now and your skill at staying under the radar at work. You clean up well. Poor John's in for a big surprise when he gets here." She flashed a smile at me. "Most of the people I teach to use our systems are men, Steve. Let's just say they follow instructions much better when they're focused on the screen and not trying to sneak a glance at my natural assets. Well, now you know the secret to my success in the business, Steve." "Yeah, it was quite the surprise when I realized it was you sitting here." "Oh, don't play that with me, Steve. I'd bet good money you watched my every step as I walked in, and it probably took you a while to finally meet my eyes." I'll admit, yes, I did. And honestly, who could blame me? "Sherry, you are one stunning example of your gender. Too bad you don't date coworkers." I smirked at her. "Steve, you've always been a smooth talker, even to that office nerd. But remember, we don't work for the same company, so technically we're not colleagues." What a delightful idea, Sherry. If only there weren't one tiny problem. I'm married. Darn, just when I thought I'd get lucky. She laughed. But if you ever get bored of married life, you know where to find my company's number. We must have been joking together like that for about 20 minutes before Sherry's date finally showed up. After getting over the surprise, they left together. I grabbed another drink and returned to my corner table to wait for my colleagues. I'm not sure how long after, maybe 10 or 20 minutes, I went to the restroom. While I was in there, another guy came in and started using the urinal next to mine. Pretty girl, he commented. Sorry? I responded, unsure if I had heard him right. It's always a bit awkward when a stranger starts talking to you in the restroom. You can never be sure what their intentions are. But I tried to stay courteous. The young lady you were talking to at the bar, she's pretty, he clarified. Yes, she is, isn't she? Are you in town on business? He asked as I began washing my hands. Yeah, we're setting up a new branch office. Married? He inquired. Yes, I am. Why do you ask? Oh, I was just thinking married men away from home should be mindful of who's watching when they talk to pretty girls in hotel bars. The guy was washing his hands while I dried mine under the air dryer. He was seriously confusing me. I couldn't figure out if he was some weirdo trying to hit on me or some shady pimp scouting for business. Are you implying something? I asked. Yeah, that you've been at the bar 3 nights this week, and every time you're there. So is that little creep over in the corner? Haven't you noticed him? Number, I don't get what you're trying to say. The moment you started talking to that young woman just now, he began messing with his phone. And get this, when you head up to your room in the evening, he moves out into the lobby and lingers there until after midnight. By this point, we were leaving the restroom, and the guy told me he couldn't say much more because he thought the idiot hiding in the corner might have noticed him watching. He asked for my mobile number, said he'd call in a few minutes, then walked out of the hotel's main entrance. Still confused, I went back to my seat at the bar, wondering why on earth I had just given a complete stranger my phone number. Sure enough, my phone rang a few minutes later. It was him, and he told me to sit quietly and just listen. Then he shared a nearly unbelievable story. He rambled a bit, but the main point was that he had recently been set up by his ex-wife. He explained that, while on a business trip, he had innocently started chatting with a pretty young woman at a hotel bar. During their conversation, she told him she had come into the bar to hide from her abusive ex-husband, whom she had spotted outside on the street before he could see her. It hadn't crossed my gullible new friend's mind that sitting at the bar wasn't exactly the best place to hide. If he hadn't been so taken by her looks and story, he might have realized that a dark corner would have been a better choice for hiding. Anyway, she showed him bruises on her face and arms, making him believe she'd recently been assaulted. As a result, he completely fell for her story, hook, line, and sinker. She suddenly claimed that her husband was about to walk into the bar and hurriedly left through a door at the back. Concerned for her safety, my new acquaintance followed her and quickly found her trying to hide in a small alcove in the hallway. He suggested getting her a room for the night where she could hide, but she insisted she couldn't enter the hotel's lobby because her ex-husband would likely spot her. Yeah, even I could see where this was heading. After much discussion, it was decided that the young woman would take his key and hide in his room, while my new friend booked her a separate room. He'd then give her the key so she could stay there for the night, and that's essentially what happened. As soon as he gave her the key, she hugged and kissed him on the cheek to thank him, and he walked her to the room before heading back to his own. The next morning, he didn't see her and shrugged off the whole event as a somewhat pricey act of old-fashioned gallantry. Feeling quietly proud of himself, he thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, while unpacking his suitcase, his wife discovered a pair of women's underwear hidden at the bottom, and all hell broke loose. Within days, he was served divorce papers, which revealed that a young woman had confessed to having an affair with him in the hotel room that night. There were even photos of him with the woman at the bar and entering or leaving his hotel room. He insisted the entire setup had been orchestrated by his wife and her lover, who he later found out had been her boss before they had children. Although he had no proof of this and no evidence that his wife had been involved with the man until after the divorce proceedings began and they were officially separated. "It was all too convenient," he exclaimed. "The bastard was over at the house with her the very night the judge issued the separation order, and I couldn't go near the place because she accused me of threatening her. Now she's got the house because I'm required to provide a home for the kids until they're grown. I'm stuck paying child support, alimony, and upkeep on the damn house. Meanwhile, that prick is sleeping with my ex-wife in it." "I understand your frustration," I replied once he had finished. "But what does this have to do with me?" "Are you sitting at that corner table you and your friends have been using all week?" he asked. "Yes." "Try not to be too obvious, but in the far corner of the room, there should be a young guy sitting alone. I imagine he's almost hidden from you by that giant plant over there." I glanced casually in the direction my new acquaintance had pointed. Sure enough, there was someone behind the plant, but I couldn't make out who it was. "Yes, I think I see him." "Well, I don't know what his game is, but that little weasel is watching you, my friend. I'm just giving you a heads up because you seem like a decent guy, and I wouldn't want you to get set up like I was." "That's very kind of you, my friend. But I have no intention of straying from the straight and narrow." Neither did I, and in fact I didn't. But that didn't stop me from getting set up. For some reason, your wife must think you're up to something when you're away from home. "Never. In fact, I'm rarely away. This is my first trip in over a year," I informed him. "That's rather strange, isn't it? Why else would that guy be following you?" "Following me?" "Yes, of course. He's followed you into the hotel for the last 3 nights. "That's nonsense, my friend. It's probably just a coincidence that we've arrived at the hotel around the same time every evening." "He doesn't stay at the hotel. He leaves just after 1 in the morning. Look, I can prove it to you. Finish your drink, then leave the hotel and walk down to the Plume of Feathers. It's only a couple of 100 yards away. There are plenty of entrances. So if he's really watching you, he'll have to follow you into the pub to make sure you don't slip out one of the other doors. If you stand by the bar, you can watch for him in the mirror behind it." I passed by the other guys as I left the hotel and told them I'd be back soon. It wasn't until I was halfway to the Plume of Feathers that I started wondering if I was making a mistake. After all, there was a real chance I was walking into a situation where I could get mugged or something. The streets were completely empty. I got to the Plume safely and ordered a pint. Sure enough, the young idiot I'd quickly glanced at when leaving the hotel bar walked in, bought a drink at the far end of the bar, and took a seat across the room where he could clearly keep an eye on me. A couple of minutes later, my phone rang again. Was I right, or was I right? "Yeah," I admitted. "He's over by the wall trying to act like he's not watching me." "What are you going to do about him?" "I have no bloody idea." "Well, just don't do anything stupid like letting him know you've noticed him or chatting up some random person." "Let me think about it, and I'll call you tomorrow." "But what if he's planning to rob me or something?" "No, he's not that kind. I reckon he's a college student making some extra cash by working for a dodgy private detective agency. He definitely doesn't know how to follow someone discreetly. I didn't spot him. You, my friend, are a bit too much like me. The idea of straying never crosses your mind, so you don't have a reason to keep checking behind you. Now your red-headed mate? He's always on the lookout. I'm surprised he hasn't noticed your shadow. That red-headed colleague he mentioned is the office Casanova, and at first I had suspected that Sherry had come to the hotel to meet him. After finishing my pint at the Plume, I made my way back to the hotel, taking a winding route by the river, hoping it looked like I was just out for some fresh air. When I got back to the hotel, the guys were curious about where I'd been, but they didn't press me for details. We got on with looking over the office plans and discussing what we hoped to achieve the next day. Later, as I left the bar to head to my room, I caught a glimpse out of the corner of my eye. Someone was hiding behind that damn plant again. "Are you all right?" my new friend asked when he called me the next afternoon. "Yeah, I'm fine, but I still don't get why that kid's following me." "Do you want to find out?" "Yes, I think I do. Someone's got to be paying him, and if my wife's wasting my hard-earned money on this, I'll be pretty pissed." "Okay, leave it to me. There are a couple of divorced guys working at the office I'm stationed at. I'll need to keep out of sight because the kid might recognize me, but we've got a solid plan. They'll grab the kid and question him without letting on that you know he's been tailing you." "That's going to be tricky, isn't it?" "Not really. The guys are going to pretend they've been hired to follow you too and get tough with him. He's just a kid. He'll probably freak out. Anyway, they'll tell him that if he comes clean, they won't tell whoever hired him that he screwed up. Hopefully he'll stay quiet instead of risking losing his gig." We arranged for me to take another walk around the same time as the previous evening, but this time I'd follow a specific route leading me down a dark alley. I'll admit, when I entered the alley, I had second thoughts, wondering if I was being set up for something bad. Halfway down, I noticed two figures lurking in the shadows. I was a bit relieved when one of them said, "Keep moving. He's about 50 yards behind you." I continued my walk, and nothing unusual happened that I could tell. Later that night, I noticed someone back near the plant as I headed to my room. "Well, it worked, but it doesn't really make sense," said my new friend when I picked up my phone just after midnight. "Oh, he spoke then?" "Yes, he really did. They couldn't get him to stop talking." "Well, to me, they look like big guys." In a pitch-black alley at that hour, everyone seems like a big guy, my friend. But this is something you won't believe. I can hardly wrap my head around it. Your little tail has to pick you up from your office every evening. He has to follow you until midnight, and only when he's sure you've gone to bed can he call it a night and head home. Is that all? Yes, he's working part-time for a local detective agency, just as we suspected. But they're not particularly interested in your activities or whereabouts unless you're heading to the train station. The train station? Yes, you know, those things that run on tracks. Right. That's how I got up here. It made no sense to drive. The interesting part is, if you do go to the station, he needs to watch which train you board. If it's a northbound train, he can go home. But if you get on a southbound train, well, he has a phone number he must call right away. Southbound, you say? Yes, I assume you live on the south coast, my friend? I do. But why would you take a train north? My sister lives about half an hour up the line. I think that's bad news, don't you? Yeah, do you have the number that guy is supposed to call? I'll text it to you as soon as we hang up. Thanks. What are you planning to do, my friend? I think I'll visit my sister tomorrow night. Do you need any backup? That would be nice. I have no idea what I'm walking into. Text me the time of the train you'll be taking tomorrow, and we'll meet you at the next station along the route. Oh, and if you see my two friends anywhere, don't acknowledge them, okay? They're complete strangers to you, and it might be safer that way. Is that really necessary? They're two very angry ex-husbands, my friend. Just give them a nod and they'll be more than willing to handle anything you need once we're safely on the train back here. I'm sorry? These days all stations have CCTV cameras, my friend. They're practically undeniable when you need an alibi. I didn't recognize the phone number my tail was supposed to call. It was a mobile number anyway, so even if I had tried to trace it, it likely wouldn't lead anywhere. The next evening, after traveling one station north, I switched to a southbound train, where I was joined by my new friend one station down the line from where I began my journey. He told me that the young man had seen my northbound train leave and then left the station, presumably to get an early night. I saw no trace of the two large, dark figures I had encountered in the alley the previous evening, and my new friend didn't mention them. We naturally discussed what I might find when I arrived home and what we would do if no one was there. My wife hadn't mentioned going out, so we assumed she was expecting someone at home. Of course, there was always the possibility that I could call later in the evening. I had already done that once this week, and upon reflection, my wife had sounded a bit distracted. She had told me she was in the middle of a TV show and had muted it when the phone rang, trying to follow along with the subtitles. Constance had always been into those silly soap operas, so I accepted her explanation at the time. Now, though, I was starting to have doubts. I was trying to remember what other sounds I might have heard in the background during our call. Something I barely caught was bothering me, and I thought a couple of times that Constance might have covered the microphone. She had giggled at one point in our conversation, but I figured she was just laughing at something on her show. Looking around, I noticed that only my new friend and I got off the train at my station. He must have picked up on my unease. "Don't worry, they're already here. They came by car earlier," he said. As we walked towards my house, my companion began speaking to himself. For a moment I thought he had lost his mind, but then I realized he was wearing one of those Bluetooth headsets. He was clearly talking to the two dark figures. He told me we should hide for a bit. Constance was still alone, but she was expecting someone. When I asked how he knew, he explained that she had opened the garage door about 5 minutes ago and moved our car out onto the street. "Looks like her visitor plans to stay all night," he remarked. We spent some time browsing shop windows in the town center, where we wouldn't be visible from the road, until my companion received word that the game was underway. Then we headed to my house. My companion stopped me from rushing in like a bull in a china shop. He reminded me that tonight likely wasn't Constance's first visitor, so there was no use in closing the barn door after the horse had already escaped. We needed to allow them enough time to fully engage in whatever they were about to do, so I could gather the evidence necessary for a court case. My companion clearly had more experience in these matters than I did, so I decided to follow his advice. We stayed in the back garden for about 20 minutes, but eventually impatience got the better of me, and I crept to the window at the back of the living room. Fortunately, the curtains Constance was so pleased with had shrunk a little after she washed them. I still didn't have time to lift the steps to adjust the lace with the frills, so they didn't close completely in the middle. I really would never have thought that Constance would be capable of such a thing. She was with Tony Copeland. He was one of the members of our local council and a prospective candidate for the next general election, as our current member of Parliament had already announced his resignation. It was obvious that Constance adhered to what one former president of the United States called a lack of intimacy, I must admit, I had a different view on this. The only reason I found out the guy's name was Tony Copeland was because Constance was distributing flyers for his political party before the last local elections. Constance wasn't a committed party member or anything like that, but she was involved in this election campaign in some way. Since then, I have often wondered if Constance's affair with Copeland was a consequence of her work for the party during the election, or if her newfound interest in local politics was a result of her relationship with him. I have to admit the fact that I may never know the answer. I was probably still lost in thought when my companion pulled me away from the window. For obvious reasons, I tried my best to keep myself in check. Once we were a good distance from the house, my companion handed me a small video camera with a lanyard to wear around my neck. He explained that once we were inside, I needed to keep the camera focused on Copeland and Constance for as long as possible. However, if Copeland attempted to attack me, I was to let go of the camera and defend myself. He reminded me that the camera would keep recording, even if it was just hanging from the lanyard, and that I must not make any threats of physical violence against either of them once we were in the house. If he comes at you, do whatever you want to defend yourself, but don't initiate any violence. I'll keep this camera on you the whole time to show that you didn't attack him, and I'll try to keep one focused on both of them, too. 2 cameras? I asked. Yep, it's my business to sell video cameras in bulk. Didn't I mention that? You haven't shared anything about yourself. I don't even know your name. Probably for the best, especially if you decide later on that you want the boys to take care of things. After quietly entering the garage and gradually deflating all of Copeland's car tires, we moved through the fire door and into the kitchen. From there, we could actually see and record what was happening in the lounge, where Copeland was now returning the favor to Constance. It took all my self-control, aided by my companion's influence, to stop myself from rushing into the room and using my right boot to ensure that Copeland would be singing alto from that day forward, or perhaps castrato. Either way, my supportive friend convinced me that neither the boot nor the carving knife from the kitchen rack would contribute positively to my long-term well-being. He suggested that HMG's extended holiday homes are places to visit, not establishments where you'd want to end up incarcerated for 10 or 15 years. I truly don't understand how Constance never noticed us standing there recording the scene. Copeland had been doing this for several minutes when the cell phone on the coffee table rang. This made him stop for a moment and look at the phone that rang. After a moment's thought, he rolled over on the couch, pulling Constance with him, and answered the phone that was still ringing. To my surprise, Constance complied. The strange part was that by that time Constance was gazing into the mirror on the wall behind our sofa, almost as if she were staring directly into the eyes of my companion and me through the reflection. It was impossible to tell where her thoughts were. Copeland lifted the phone to his ear and said, "Hello?" That's when things started to become amusing. I could only hear his side of the conversation, so I had no real clue about what the caller was saying, but I could somewhat grasp the overall situation. "How did you get this number?" Copeland asked sharply. "No, I have no intention of making any statements to the press. How dare you, young man? If you publish such accusations in your newspaper, I will ensure you lose your job." Constance had stopped her movements and was now looking down at Copeland. She must have picked up on something in his tone, or perhaps whatever the reporter had said had suddenly dampened Copeland's mood for intimacy, affecting him physically. "Listen here. I'm visiting a local resident on official council business. It's part of my responsibilities as a counselor to help." "That's not your concern, young man. Her husband knows I am here tonight." During Copeland's phone call, Constance's gaze abruptly darted to the wall mirror, and her face filled with terror. "Steve! Oh no, not Steve!" she cried out loudly. Constance's unexpected scream startled Copland, prompting him to look at her. I can only speculate that he noticed she was fixated on something in the mirror, as he leaned to the side to get a better view of my companion and me. There are few occasions in my life when I've witnessed genuine fear in someone's eyes, but that night, I saw it vividly in Copland's. I'm unsure if he ended the call or not, but in his panic he violently pushed Constance away, causing her to hit the floor and crash her head against the coffee table, briefly rendering her unconscious. I must say I've never seen anyone get dressed so quickly. Copland soon found his jacket and put it on in haste. My companion nudged me further into the lounge as we continued to film Copland in his frantic attempt to leave. I later realized that he had moved us away from the kitchen doorway to clear a path for Copland to reach the garage where his car was parked. With shoes in one hand and his undergarments in the other, Copland dashed past us into the garage. I soon heard him shout, "You bastards!" Meanwhile, my companion instructed me to check on Constance, but also cautioned me to keep my camera focused on her, while he followed Copland. I figured from Copland's shout that he must have realized his car had 4 flat tires. Regardless, I heard the garage door roll up and him trying to drive away. At that moment, I was with Constance, who was just regaining consciousness. Once she became aware, she sat up, looked me straight in the eye, and then fainted again, hitting her head on the floor in the process. From my perspective, it seemed like Constance was having a rather rough evening. I thought it best to call for medical help for Constance, so while keeping the camera focused on her ND form, I moved to our landline and dialed 999. I was informed that an ambulance and the police were already en route. In fact, I could hear the sirens before I even hung up the phone. It was rather strange. I was still there filming the now semi-conscious Constance when the paramedic burst into the living room. Time for us to go, my friend. My companion had returned and was gently pushing me toward the door. He also placed a pair of sunglasses on my face and an oversized trilby on my head, pulling it down over the sunglasses. I had no idea where he got either item and was surprised to see he was dressed similarly. I soon understood why as we left through the garage. A TV camera crew, local news I presumed, and several reporters were ready to pounce. They bombarded us with questions far too numerous to answer, while my companion guided me to a waiting taxi. Another stranger stepped in between the reporters and us, repeatedly stating, "My client has no statement to make at this time." As the taxi drove us to the train station, I glanced over at my companion. "Was everything you told me a load of crap?" I asked. "No, my wife set me up just like I said. But her lawyer, well, he's a real piece of work. You met him tonight." "Copland?" "Yeah, Copland." Then last week, a friend of mine who runs a PI business told me that a certain Tony Copland had contacted him, asking to keep an eye on you. My friend didn't like the sound of the job. It didn't add up, and Copland wouldn't explain what it was about, so he declined. But knowing how much I despised Copland, my friend tipped me off. He said Copland was keen to know if you had any plans to return home unexpectedly. It wasn't hard to figure out what he was up to. Sorry about the press, but I wanted to make sure Copland's political ambitions crashed. Hopefully it'll damage his legal career too. Once the media sinks its teeth into him, I'm sure they'll forget all about you and your wife. There's a lot more dirt in Copland's past for them to chew on. We were on the train heading back north when my companion informed me that Constance was in the local hospital. According to his source, she had a hairline fracture in her skull. He then asked if I wanted anything done to Copland after the police were finished with him. I glanced at him, puzzled. and he clarified that Copland had discovered it's quite difficult to drive with 4 flat tires. He had crashed into at least 3 parked cars and ended up inside a shop window. The last anyone saw of him, he was being loaded into the back of a police van. My companion, who was clearly still in touch with witnesses at the scene via his mobile phone, was a bit unclear about why Copland had been arrested. He simply called it a traffic violation. That seemed reasonable to me. Driving with 4 flat tires surely can't be legal. Later I learned from TV and newspaper reports that Copland had panicked when the garage door began to rise, revealing the press and TV crews gathered outside. He was standing in the garage in a state of undress, with my companion blocking his access to the switch that would lower the door. In his panic, Copland had jumped into his vehicle and attempted to drive away. According to a brief account I read in the press, his car did manage to move down the road, but it clipped the TV crew's van as it left my driveway and struck several other parked vehicles along the street. Then, when Copland tried to turn onto the main road, he apparently collided with a passing truck. It seems that this impact gave his car enough momentum to crash into a shopfront. What a pity our taxi drove off in the opposite direction that night. I would have loved to witness the chaos firsthand. During our journey, my companion informed me that it was likely the last time we would meet that evening. However, he added that if everything went according to plan, I'd hear from him at some point in the future. He apologized once again for the unwanted attention, but explained that he needed something dramatic to set things in motion. It took me many months to understand what he meant. I'll get back to that later. At one point, as our train crossed a bridge over a river, my companion tossed the mobile phone he had been using out of the window. He told me that I wouldn't be able to contact him through that phone anymore, and neither would anyone else. "Keep the video camera, I've got plenty more," he said with a grin. "What about the footage in those other cameras?" I asked. "You've got enough for your purposes on that camera's chip, Steve. I have plans for the footage in these, and I might need to stir things up a bit. But don't worry, your wife's face will stay out of the headlines." "Who cares?" I responded. "You do, my friend, and I'm sorry for what's coming. No man likes the idea of everyone knowing his wife's been unfaithful for who knows how long. It's not good for a man's ego, I can assure you. That's just human nature." My companion got off the train a few stops before me. He shook my hand, apologized once more for the publicity and any potential consequences that might come my way in the future. He promised to do everything he could to mitigate them, but didn't explain what he thought might occur. Before leaving, he handed me a business card saying it belonged to the solicitor who had been outside my house. He assured me the solicitor was trustworthy and recommended I use him for my divorce, should I choose to pursue one, or for any other future needs. As the train pulled away, I realized I would never see him in person again. But I would hear from him indirectly and see his face again, though that's a story for later. The night receptionist stopped me as I entered the hotel and handed me a parcel labeled "Urgent." I took it with me to the bar, where, truthfully, I had planned to drink heavily. Who wouldn't given the circumstances? Tearing off the brown paper from the parcel at the bar, I found the manufacturer's packaging for the small video camera now in my pocket, along with a printed note. The note essentially instructed me not to get drunk. Instead, I was to go to my room and make at least one copy of the file from the camera's memory card onto my laptop, and preferably several copies on any available media. It also suggested that I not keep the copies and the original in the same place. After finishing the scotch and chaser I had ordered, I followed the note's instructions. I made one copy of the file onto a DVD, which I later placed in the hotel's safe, and sent a second copy to my sister. I could only make 2 extra copies since I only had a couple of blank DVDs and CDs in my laptop case. I guess it was morbid curiosity that made me watch the footage again before trying to get some sleep. In the end, I didn't sleep all that well. God only knows what I must have looked like the next day, but everyone at the office kept their distance as much as possible. Sometime mid-morning, 2 plainclothes police officers showed up, wanting to have a quiet word with me. I took them to an empty office for some privacy. They explained there was some uncertainty about how exactly Constance, who claimed she couldn't remember anything from the night before, ended up with a fractured skull, even though it was just a hairline fracture. From the way they spoke, I could tell someone had suggested I'd been acting violently the last time they saw Constance and me together. They didn't say who, but it wasn't hard for me to figure out. They wouldn't confirm or deny if it was Copland. It took me a bit of time to find the right spot on the recording, and I asked if they wanted a copy. They actually asked for the original, but I told them I wasn't handing that over. In the end, they settled for a copy, which I burned onto a DVD while they waited. I got it from one of the computer guys. While my laptop was working on the DVD, I had one of the girls bring us some tea, and we ended up having a somewhat casual conversation about the past few days. Well, as casual as you can get with police officers on duty. They seemed very curious about my mysterious friend, but I think it was just out of curiosity. The video showed he hadn't hurt Constance either. The officers were actually wondering if there might be a case against Copland since he had pushed Constance off of him quite aggressively. They said they'd get the CPS to look into it. I think they were just curious about who had a grudge against Copland and why. They told me to be careful and hinted that Copland was a pretty influential lawyer. At the same time, they subtly suggested that they suspected Copland wasn't entirely clean in all his dealings. Like sleeping with other people's wives, you mean? I remarked. Oh, much more than that, Steve. We just can't pin him down. Let's just say he's unofficially on the radar of many police officers. But if you don't mind me saying, you seem to be taking all this quite lightly, Steve. What am I supposed to do, officer? Lose my temper and start making a scene? If I had reacted the way you expected, wouldn't you be leading me to your car in handcuffs right now? I asked. Yes, Steve, we probably would have. The officer smiled back. In my experience, officer, once things go wrong and everything falls apart, the best response is to laugh, or at least try to. It really messes with the minds of those who wish you harm. Both officers laughed and shook my hand as they left. Later that day, I went out to find a working phone booth and called the lawyer my friend had recommended. He had been expecting my call and asked straight away if I was going to file for divorce. I told him I had little choice if I wanted to maintain my dignity. He said he'd get things moving and asked if he could send one of his staff to meet me later to collect all the personal details about Constance and me. I asked if I should give the woman a check to retain his services, but he told me that was already handled. Don't ask, Steve, but you'll never receive an invoice for my services. Someone we both know is planning to make Copland cover the costs. He comes from a wealthy background and has made plenty of money on his own, though not all of it entirely legal. That evening, the entire crew was waiting for me at the bar, clearly hoping that I had calmed down enough and would be willing to share what happened the night before. By then, they had all seen the day's newspapers. I found it amusing that, after what happened that morning, I hadn't noticed any of those newspapers lying around the office. I gave them the short version. I had gone home and caught Constance in bed with Tony Copland. They asked about all the media coverage, but I claimed I didn't know anything about it. And honestly, that was the truth. I had no idea how any of it had gotten out. At around 9 p.m., my new solicitor's associate, who was not only extremely attractive but also highly competent, arrived at the hotel to meet with me. We went to the hotel library for a private discussion. The first thing Ms. Clarkson, yes, she was that type, mentioned was that she had already spoken with Constance and advised her to quickly find her own solicitor once she's discharged from the hospital. It's much easier when someone's own solicitor explains to them that they don't have a case. Your wife doesn't want a divorce, you know? Yeah, I know. Here, look at all the texts and messages she's been sending me today, I said, showing her my phone. Has she tried calling you? Yes, but I've been rather occupied up here. I assume she and Copland were counting on that. Exactly. It seems Copland has been pursuing her for some time now. She claims he only succeeded this week, but in my experience, people tend to be selective with the truth when it suits them. Well, I doubt he would go through the trouble and expense of tracking my movements unless he believed he'd have the chance to be with Constance. I think screw is the word you're looking for, Mr. Marshall. Steve, Miss Clarkson, everyone calls me Steve. Very well, Steve, but I'm still Miss Clarkson to everyone except my fiancé. I imagine he must be quite the handsome man. And very patient, Steve. Trust me. Oh, I believe it, Miss Clarkson, I believe it. She gave me a small smile, cracking her professional demeanor for the first time, but quickly returned to the matter at hand. Surprisingly, she already knew most of what she needed. Ms. Clarkson pulled out a sheet of paper from her briefcase and went through a list of questions. She asked for Constance's and my full names, birth dates, and details about our wedding. I saw her check off boxes next to the answers she had already prepared. There were only a couple of minor inaccuracies, but that was all. She had everything covered, including the value of our house, though not the specifics of our bank accounts or savings. Not that I could recall those details myself. Ms. Clarkson then placed a document in front of me to sign. Essentially, it was a contract authorizing her boss to represent me in matters concerning my divorce from Constance and any other legal issues that might arise, regardless of their connection to the divorce, until I decided to revoke that authorization in writing. Before she left, Ms. Clarkson recommended that I call Constance and talk to her. I made it clear that I had no intention of forgiving Constance for what she had done. Ms. Clarkson also mentioned that Constance could be found at her sister's house. Your home is being monitored by the press. You might find more peace if you choose to stay somewhere else this weekend, Steve. Ms. Clarkson always seemed a bit uneasy calling me Steve. By the way, your employer is doing a good job of keeping your location vague. I couldn't help but wonder who had requested that and, more importantly, when it had been arranged. After Ms. Clarkson left and I was discreetly questioned about my charming visitor, I went upstairs to call Constance. The guys were somewhat taken aback when I told them that Ms. Clarkson was a representative from my solicitor's office. They couldn't quite understand why she had come to see me at such a late hour and were curious about how much my legal fees would be. June, Constance's sister, answered the phone, and our conversation was brief and to the point. All June could express was her personal regret about the situation and her hope that we could remain friends. Then she mentioned she would go and fetch the silly daft cow. Those 4 words really conveyed June's feelings about her sister's actions, I believe. About a year later, while I was on my honeymoon in Malta, I coincidentally ran into June again. But I'll get to that later. Apparently, the press didn't track me down until after I had spent the weekend with my sister and her family. My sister and her husband were very understanding and didn't press me for details. Honestly, they probably had read most of it in the newspapers already. On Sunday evening, when I returned to the hotel, I was served with an injunction. I couldn't make sense of it, but over the phone, Ms. Clarkson explained that Copland had obtained an emergency court order preventing me from releasing any media related to the evening in question to the press or posting it online. Honestly, legal jargon usually confuses me, but Ms. Clarkson managed to get the main point across. But I didn't, and I had no intention to. I protested. We know, but someone else has and is still trying to embarrass Copland. Oops. Yes, and you should expect to be summoned to appear before a high court judge tomorrow morning. But don't worry, we've got it handled. I'm glad to hear you're not worried. That's what you pay us for. What can a high court judge do to me? Send me to prison? Well, yes, but as I said, we have that covered. On Monday afternoon, I found myself in the court dock facing a very angry-looking judge. I remained silent while my barristers, several of them clad in wigs and gowns, handled the proceedings. They informed the judge that an anonymous third party possessed 2 recordings similar to mine, which had been filmed simultaneously. To my surprise, a police photographic analyst confirmed that the images in question were not stills from my recording. Incidentally, these 2 photos had somehow reached the national press. I believe that if Copland had taken no action, only the more disreputable and sensationalist outlets would have published them. But they eventually did, alongside every other newspaper and media outlet that could get their hands on them. Both pictures featured Tony Copland. In one, he was peering around the side of Constance's NACD body with a look of surprise on his face. In the other, he was in the process of putting on his trousers while Constance lay NACD on the floor behind him. Constance was not recognizable in either image. The judge seemed skeptical that I truly didn't know the identity of my mysterious companion that night, and he practically said as much. However, he eventually appeared to accept my barrister's arguments. He reminded me, in fact, he clarified that I had not understood the court order served to me at the hotel, that there was a temporary ban on the publication of all recordings made in the house that fateful evening. After that, I was told I could leave. It was quite a struggle to push my way past the swarm of reporters outside the courthouse. Copland had managed to secure an emergency injunction on the grounds that the events took place inside a private residence, claiming he had a reasonable expectation of privacy, or something to that effect. The newspapers actively contested the injunction against publication, and I strongly suspect my legal team assisted them. When the case came before a full court hearing a few days later, the judge promptly dismissed the injunction. The essence of the judge's ruling was that the property in question was my house, not Copland's, and he could not reasonably expect any privacy within its walls, particularly in one of the communal areas. Moreover, since the recordings were made by me and a guest of mine, even though I didn't know the man at all, Copland had no grounds to object to them entering the public domain, either fully or partially. At least, that's what I believe the judge conveyed. It's likely that the entire affair did little more than heighten public interest in the story. Almost all newspapers and TV news programs featured it prominently, and many displayed the 2 photos and several others that emerged in the following days. When they were finally cleared by the courts, the sensational headlines and stories associated with those photos were remarkable from my viewpoint. One read, "Caught in the act," while another said, "A coward's retreat." The accompanying story described how Copland was calmly getting dressed while his lover lay unconscious on the floor beside him. It was clear that whoever was extracting stills from the video and supplying them to the press was being very cautious. Constance's face had either been entirely removed from the frame or effectively blurred out. You could say that life returned to normal after my incident with the High Court judge. I completed my second week at the new office and then returned home. However, I found I couldn't stay in the house, so I temporarily set up in a small hotel not far from work. Meanwhile, Ms. Clarkson reached out to let me know that a solicitor representing Constance had contacted her. From what Ms. Clarkson relayed, it seemed that Constance was facing a tough time from the press. They must have found out she was staying at June's house. Anyway, Ms. Clarkson mentioned that Constance's solicitor stated his client did not want a divorce, but if I insisted, she was willing to accept my proposed terms. "We told him that your name isn't Hamilton," Ms. Clarkson said, giggling. "Hamilton," I echoed, completely clueless about its significance. "Come on, Steve, catch up. What year are we in? Trafalgar, Nelson, Lady Hamilton?" "Oh yes, very amusing," I replied, though I was genuinely baffled by Ms. Clarkson. Ms. Clarkson also informed me that Constance was eager to finalize everything. Perhaps she thought it would make the press leave her alone. However, I believed the media had already moved on to other stories well before our divorce case was actually addressed, though it did get a small headline in the local papers. I had agreed to split everything evenly, as long as Constance acknowledged that her affair was the primary reason for the breakdown of our marriage. She also needed to agree to testify in any future legal actions I might pursue against Copland. Surprisingly, Constance's legal team requested that I appear in court as a witness in a case she was filing against Copland. This baffled me until Ms. Clarkson explained that it was likely a personal injury claim, and that the video we had of the incident, which had already been sent to Constance's solicitor, would probably be sufficient for Copland to settle out of court. I assume he did, as I never heard anything more about it. The house sold very quickly. The market was quite favorable at that time. Constance came by to take a few items she wanted, and I had the rest stored until I found another place that appealed to me. However, I wasn't really motivated to search. Staying in a hotel might not seem appealing, but you get accustomed to it. It requires less effort, no cooking or anything, and it turned out to be cheaper than paying a mortgage. Plus, I enjoyed free parking right in the heart of the town. Every so often, a reporter would find me, and I was even willing to speak with them. They didn't seem particularly interested in Constance and me anyway. Most were curious about what I knew about my enigmatic friend. Unfortunately, I couldn't provide them with any information. However, a couple of reporters I got along with confided that they believed there was more to Copland than what had been revealed, and they suspected it had to do with my mysterious friend. I ended up passing their business cards to Ms. Clarkson, but by then, she claimed she had no personal knowledge of the man either. This contradicted some of the things she had said to me earlier, but she had specifically used the phrase, personal knowledge. I wasn't quite sure, but it felt like 2 or maybe even 3 months had passed since that fateful night, though it wasn't particularly important. One day I was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen as usual, when my desk shook slightly as someone sat on it. I turned my head to the left and saw a pair of knees clad in gray flannel. Glancing further, I noticed that the flannel material extended almost to a pair of Nike sneakers. As I followed my gaze up, I found an oversized blue sweater, topped with a tousle of mousy blonde hair and a pair of huge black horn-rimmed glasses. "Hi, handsome. What's a nice guy like you doing in a place like this?" Sherry asked. "Hey, Sherry! Long time, no see." "What brings you around here?" I replied. Sherry explained that our company had become one of her employer's major clients, and she was assigned to visit us once a month. Her purpose was to circulate and chat with the employees in various departments to see if they had any suggestions for program modifications that could make their work easier. "So, what can I do for you?" "I'm satisfied with things as they are." "Well, you'd be the first to let them know upstairs if you weren't happy." "No, Steve, I'm here to collect a debt." I had no idea what expression crossed my face, but it made Sherry giggle. "Hey there, handsome, you owe me dinner." "I do?" "Absolutely. You told me you couldn't take me out because you were married, and from what I've read in the papers, it seems you're practically single now." "I did?" "Not in those exact words, but that was the overall impression from our conversation that night in the hotel bar." "It was?" I tried to maintain a puzzled look at this point. "Come on, Steve, stop joking around." "I honestly can't remember what you said that evening." "Steve." "All right, gorgeous. I haven't gone out in weeks. It might be nice. Where do you want to go?" "Oh, nothing special. I need to catch my train home just after 9. "Now that's disappointing." "Dinner?" I said, "Steve. Behave yourself." Why do the good-looking ones always say that? "I'll be in reception when you finish up." She grinned and then hopped off my desk, leaving the department. The change in Sherry was still astonishing to witness. She was impossible to overlook when I stepped out of the lift. Honestly, I doubt any man who had walked through the reception area while she was waiting for me could have missed her, and they probably wished she was waiting for them instead. The 2 security guards she was talking to, both likely in their late 50s or early 60s, were clearly captivated by Sherry. As I approached, she pulled away from them and grabbed my arm. "Where are we going?" she asked. "First, I need to stop by my hotel to change." "There's no time, handsome. We have less than 4 hours. My train leaves at 9. "But—" "No buts, Steve. We have a lot to discuss." I reluctantly agreed, and one of the security guards insisted on carrying Sherry's holdall as we made our way to my car. Once Sherry's holdall and briefcase were stowed in the trunk along with mine, I drove us to a pub just outside of town that I knew served food all day. We chatted while enjoying a leisurely meal. Rather than demanding, Sherry encouraged me to express my thoughts and feelings. There was something about her that made me feel I could open up, and I instinctively trusted that what I shared would remain confidential. After I finished sharing, Sherry surprised me by shifting to a more confrontational tone, explaining why she had managed to secure a meal from me. "Steve, you really need to do something about yourself, my friend. All the female staff in the office are saying you're not the same fun-loving guy you used to be. They admit they can't blame you given the circumstances, but they genuinely want to see a hint of the old Steve." "I don't quite understand, Sherry. I imagine you don't see it yourself. You've always been fun to work with. I even noticed it when we worked on projects together." "What, 4 or 5 times? And we've never worked closely. Do you realize it's practically become routine for female employees to come to good old Steve in logistics and planning with their man problems? I've heard that some of the guys even sought your advice about their wives and girlfriends." "They did?" "That's news to me. Even if they did, I don't exactly have a great track record in marital matters anymore, do I?" "That's nonsense, Steve. The reason everyone used to come to you was because you showed them how to laugh and find the humor in things. You were great at helping the girls choose birthday and Christmas gifts for their partners, and you didn't hesitate to advise them on how to break up with the losers. Did you know that, unofficially, the HR girls tell new hires that if they have any issues with the office's would-be gigolos and don't want to make an official complaint, they should talk to you? I had no idea, but I can remember. Yes, I suspect you can. But Steve, now everyone is too afraid to speak to you. They say you walk around the office like a bear with a sore head. They miss the old Steve, the one they could joke and laugh with. Look, we all get that you're upset, but living in that hotel and not going out, that just isn't good for you. You really need to get out there and maybe start dating again. There are plenty of single women at the office. Sherry, I think I understand your point. But weren't you the one who mentioned that dating colleagues can be problematic? Plus, we're out together tonight, aren't we? Yes, we're out for dinner. And I asked you to join me, remember? Yeah, but who's going to end up paying? I replied with a grin. Exactly. That's the Steve the women at the office miss. The guy who can find humor in everything, even if I plan to order the priciest dessert on the menu. Sherry shot me a smile. I see your point, and I'll try to leave my personal issues behind next time. Do better than that, Steve. Find a nice apartment or something and get out in the evenings. Even consider asking some of the single women at the office out on a date. I avoid dating coworkers because, well, I can sometimes look a bit cheap when I dress up to go out. Some guys might misinterpret it and think I'm easy. You know what I mean? And like I said before, trying to teach the average guy how to use a computer program while he's staring at my cleavage doesn't usually end well. Trust me, I've learned that the hard way. I playfully challenged Sherry, telling her she could never look cheap, and we exchanged grins before she placed her dessert order. Not the most expensive one, by the way. Curiously, we then began discussing Sherry's life and her goals. I found out she was 22. Honestly, I'd always thought she was about 19, which was pretty silly of me. I first met Sherry when we opened an office in Wales about 18 months ago, and she was very knowledgeable back then. For some reason, perhaps her style of dress, I had always thought of her as a perpetual teenager. The first time I saw her dressed up for a night out was that evening when she met that young electrician in the hotel bar. I drove Sherry to the station for her train, and she thanked me for the nice meal and the enjoyable evening. As she boarded her train, she mentioned that we should do this again sometime. I suppose I must have agreed. The next day at the office, I made a conscious effort to put on a smile whenever I could remember to. It seemed to have worked, as I noticed that after a day or two, people no longer hurried out of the tea room the moment I entered, and those who had been avoiding my desk began to stop by to chat. During lunch that day, I checked out a few real estate agents and gathered a list of furnished flats available for rent nearby. I think I was still hesitant about making a purchase, and if living alone in an apartment didn't suit me, I could always go back to the hotel. That was likely the thought lingering in the back of my mind. That Thursday, I received an intriguing call from Ms. Clarkson. "How does 250,000 sound to you, Steve?" were her opening words. "I'm sorry, I don't follow you, Ms. Clarkson." Copland isn't thrilled with all the media attention he's been receiving. That man clearly has something to hide. Anyway, the press coverage is calming down, and we thought it was time to suggest that a case for alienation of affection might be on the horizon. I suspect Constance's legal team has issued some threats as well, but I can't confirm that. Regardless, Copland's representatives initially offered us $50,000 to walk away, but after some discussions, they're now at $250,000. We might even manage to squeeze out another $25,000 or so if we push them hard enough. Go for it, Ms. Clarkson. Get every last penny from them, but I'd prefer to settle out of court. Constance isn't exactly my favorite person right now, and dragging her through a court case wouldn't leave me unscathed either. Understood, Steve. The media will likely catch wind of it anyway, but you know the drill, an undisclosed amount, which is almost as good as Copland admitting he's well, I was about to use your description of him for a moment. Less than a week later, Ms. Clarkson told me I would be £300,000 wealthier as soon as I signed the contract. I headed over immediately to make my signature. While I was doing that, Ms. Clarkson suggested that Constance might soon purchase her own new home, likely paying for it in cash. Although Ms. Clarkson was uncertain about the specific reasons Constance had for deceiving Copland, she suspected it was related to personal injury. I moved into a fairly decent apartment about a week later. Although it was farther from my office, it offered free parking, which was hard to come by in that area. It had one bedroom, a nice large lounge combined with a dining area, and a surprisingly roomy, well-equipped kitchenette. The washing machine and dryer were located in the bathroom, but the space was big enough that they weren't too noticeable. I'm not sure if it was the money that Copland had deposited into my bank accounts or if I was actually following Sherry's advice. But by the end of the month, I felt much better about myself and started going out for drinks after work every now and then with some of the guys. 3 of us were gathered around my desk, a new colleague who had joined the company about a month ago, and Bob, my boss. I was in the middle of presenting a spreadsheet I had been working on when the computer screen suddenly went blank. Just a second later, the dreaded blue screen appeared, but it was empty. Then words began to materialize in the top left corner, one character at a time. "Hi, Steve. Guess who's down here in the depths of hell tinkering with the servers?" Feeling a surge of panic, I quickly started typing. "Sherry, I'm busy right now. I have people with me." Almost immediately, a response popped up. "Whoops, sorry folks, official business, I promise. Are we still on for tonight, Steve?" To my surprise, my boss reached over and began typing. "Hi, Sherry, it's Bob. Of course, Steve is taking you out this evening. The guy hardly goes out anymore." The reply came back quickly. "Thanks, Bob. Same place, same time, Steve. And don't forget, my train leaves at 9. The screen went blank again, only to have my spreadsheet reappear. "Sorry about that," I said to my boss. "Sorry about what?" he replied, then added, "Nice girl, that's Sherry." Our new colleague looked perplexed, finally asking, "Who's Sherry?" "Someone a bit closer to your age than mine," I replied. "Come on, Steve." Bob chimed in. "She's perfect for you. You could use someone to add some excitement to your life." "Bob, I'm 12 years older than her." "So what's 12 years among friends? Seriously, you're too hung up on age." After that, we returned to tweaking the figures on my spreadsheet, making small adjustments and observing how they impacted the bottom line. About half an hour must have passed when the spreadsheet disappeared again, and a new message appeared. "Sorry, Steve. Could I get a chaperone for lunch today?" "He'll meet you in reception at 12, Bob typed back. "Thanks, Bob," came the response, and then my spreadsheet reappeared. "I will?" I asked Bob, feeling slightly annoyed that he'd arranged yet another personal engagement for me. "Of course you will. That was a request for help. When have you ever said no to a lady? It doesn't matter who asked you. The old Steve would have agreed." Have I really changed that much? Not more than expected given the circumstances, my friend. But lately, we've seen the old Steve gradually coming back. Now let's get back to these numbers. I quickly realized why Sherry had invited me to lunch. She had brought along a colleague who clearly had some ambitions. He was visibly annoyed that I was there, cramping his style during their lunch break. I'd say he was also disappointed when he found out that Sherry and I had dinner plans that evening, meaning she wouldn't be heading back with him on the same train. Sherry did a good job of keeping her distance from her co-worker. Honestly, I was surprised he didn't pick up on the signals, but maybe he thought a bit too highly of himself and his charm, as young men sometimes do. Later in the day, I wandered down to the server room where he worked and had a quiet word with him when Sherry wasn't around. On my way back to my floor, it occurred to me that it had been quite a while since I'd had to have that sort of conversation with one of the office gigolos. When I met Sherry in the reception area, she looked as lovely as she always did outside of work hours. That evening, the other security guard graciously carried her hold-all to my car. Sherry mentioned that her colleague for the day was a new guy at her company, but he had known her from college. Or, to be more precise, he was already quite familiar with how Sherry looked in civilian clothes, as she liked to call them. She also thanked me for whatever I'd said to him earlier in the afternoon. That night we, or rather Sherry, did a bit of shopping before grabbing a quick bite at a fast food place. I was pretty exhausted after all that walking through endless clothing stores when I finally saw her off at the train station. Why do women need to try on every single outfit that catches their eye? I must admit, though, I did enjoy watching Sherry come out of the dressing room each time to ask how she looked, especially as the skirts seemed to get shorter and shorter. Guys, there comes a point when you just have to speak up and say that the skirt is pushing the limits of decency. And what do? They buy it anyway. If I'd figured that out a little sooner, maybe I wouldn't have been so hungry by the time we finally sat down to eat. Over the next 6 months, my divorce was finalized, and I gradually got used to living on my own. I would occasionally go out with the guys from the office, but most of them were younger and on the hunt. Don't get me wrong, I was looking too. Just couldn't seem to find anyone who really sparked my interest. My outings with Sherry, if you could call them dates, became more regular. But don't get the wrong idea. There was nothing romantic about it. Sherry would update me on her life and often question how I was spending my free time, sometimes scolding me for not asking certain women out when I mentioned them. Sherry seemed to think that if I mentioned a woman, I must be attracted to her, which was probably true in some cases. But I just didn't feel motivated to start dating again. I felt like I was too old for it. When I shared that with Sherry, she started teasing me, calling me the old man. One morning, after Sherry had been over, I noticed a headline in the newspaper as I walked to the office. It seemed Copland had been arrested the previous day. I bought a copy and tried to read it as I walked. As is often the case with the sub judice laws in the UK, the article didn't reveal much. It only stated that Copland had been arrested and charged with conspiracy and obstructing justice. The article also listed several other individuals from around the country who had been arrested as well. A young woman faced multiple charges of perjury. 5 women, described as ex-spouses, were arrested and charged with conspiring to obstruct justice. The newspaper mentioned that several other ex-spouses were believed to have fled the country, and extradition papers were being prepared as the story went to press. Additionally, 7 more individuals were charged with various crimes, including conspiracy and aiding and abetting. Interestingly, the article also mentioned that the divorce settlements of 12 ex-husbands were being set aside, which implied they were going to be reassessed once the cases listed above were resolved. I can't say I followed the story closely, but the main point was that the same young woman had appeared in multiple divorce cases across the country, claiming to have had affairs with the husbands, and in one instance, a wife. In every case, the account was similar to the story my mysterious acquaintance had told me months earlier, and large sums of money were involved in the settlements. Eventually, I did see my mysterious acquaintance again. He appeared in the background of a news report on TV, where a journalist was standing on the steps of the High Court in London, announcing that Copland and his co-conspirators had been found guilty on all charges. The next day, Sherry came down again, which was a bit unusual since she usually came on Thursdays, and it was only Tuesday. To my surprise, she popped into my department, waving a pair of theater tickets in front of me. "What are your plans for tonight, Steve?" she asked. "Nothing much," I replied. "Great. You can take me to dinner, and then I'm treating you to a show." I reminded her, "You'll miss your train home." "No, I won't. There's one just after midnight. I'll catch that instead." Then, after a pause, she added, The last bus will be gone, but my dad will pick me up from the station. Dinner was good and the show was enjoyable. All in all, it was a great evening until we arrived at the station. We both checked the departure screen, but no trains were scheduled to go north until 5 a.m. Sherry checked the timetable and swore. She had made a mistake. The last trains left just after the hour. But for some reason, the final one departed 10 minutes before midnight. "Well, damn," she said. "Looks like I'll have to stay over." "I'll call my old hotel to see if they have a room," I offered. "Oh, don't be silly, Steve. I'll crash on your sofa and catch an early train in the morning." We debated it for a bit. I didn't see any harm in her staying at my place if she wanted to, so we didn't have a full-blown argument. Instead, we bickered over who would sleep on the sofa, with me trying to be the gentleman. Sherry shut down all my arguments by insisting she'd rather sleep on a bench at the station than force me out of my bed. Back at the flat, I found a spare sheet and decided to make her a bed on the sofa, using an old sleeping bag I kept in the car for emergencies as a blanket. Though, I had to toss it in the dryer for 20 minutes since it had been in the trunk for ages. While the dryer did its thing, we had tea, and Sherry took the opportunity to thoroughly inspect my flat. She'd been inside briefly a couple of times before, when we brought in groceries or frozen food, but this time she gave it a proper look. While she showered, I finished setting up what I thought would be an uncomfortable bed on the sofa. The discussion over who would sleep there popped up again briefly, until Sherry repeated her threat to head back to the train station. After I had taken a shower, we said goodnight, and I went to my bedroom. I'm not sure what time it was when something woke me up. There was no mistaking it. Someone was softly blowing in my left ear. "Sherry?" I called out. "Yes, Steve. You seem to be in the wrong bed, young lady. Are you complaining, old man, or just stating a fact?" "Just stating a fact, I suppose." "Good. But Sherry..." "Steve, if you bring up the 12-year age difference between us, well, that won't be the best way to start our married life, will it?" "Married life?" "Yes. Now, come on. Let's see what an old man like you can do." It didn't come as a surprise when Sherry didn't rush to catch the train first thing in the morning. I had finally figured out that she had cleverly set me up. During our walk to the office, Sherry explained that she would be staying for 4 days to train new staff in the accounts department. In fact, she didn't go home until Sunday evening that week. She also mentioned that there was an opening in her company for someone to be assigned to work with mine almost permanently. It's not full-time, of course, just 3 days a week, and it'll be very flexible. No issues with scheduling around school drop-offs and things like that. Sherry added. "Kids," I exclaimed. "Of course I want at least 2, and you'll make a great dad, Steve." "Oh, thank goodness. For a moment I thought you were going to say 12. That's what I love about you. You always find humor in everything." We were on our honeymoon. It was that quiet time between rounds when you're lying in each other's arms, too excited to fall asleep, but too exhausted to go again. Just yet. "Sherry," I asked, "how long had you been planning to become my wife?" "Good question, old man. I guess you could say since I read the headline about your first wife and that Copland fellow in the papers." "Oh, that early?" "Yes. But if you think I have a sneaky side, you might even question my reasons for getting John to pick me up for dinner at that specific hotel. I had my sights on you for a while. I'll have to keep an eye on you, won't I?" "Yes, old man. But don't confuse me with Constance. I know what I want when I see it, and I'll never do anything that would put it at risk." Well, I mentioned that Sherry and I ran into a very surprised June in Malta, so I guess I should tell you what she shared with me. June said she believed Constance had a hidden submissive side that Copland somehow noticed and took advantage of. She pointed out that from what she had read in the newspapers, many of the women involved in his divorce scheme seemed to be under his influence in some way. I hadn't kept up with the details of the case, so this was new to me. June went on to say that these women all seemed eager to take full responsibility, even though Copland was the common factor in each case. "I don't know what it is about that man, but he can wrap some women around his finger," June remarked. "But Constance turned against Copland and sued him, didn't she?" I asked. "Constance is my little sister, Steve. I've always looked out for her, and maybe that's my fault. It's possible that Constance has always been submissive to my wishes. I pushed her into that court case. I don't think she would have had the courage to go through with it without me. Fortunately, Copland backed down and settled out of court. I'm not sure how Constance would have reacted if they'd actually faced off in the courtroom." "By the way, is that your new wife, Steve?" "It sure is. Sherry chased after me and caught me." "She made a great choice." June smiled back at me.